Hello and welcome to the next of our lecture recaps. This is a recap of our lecture on ethical behaviour. So the first thing we looked at was preventing corruption, and we talked about the pieces of legislation that have been brought in over the years to try to prevent corrupt practices such as bribery. So the first one was the US Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act in 1977, which made it an offence to bribe foreign officials. So bribery and foreign officials was the main focus of that act. The UN Convention Against Corruption then came in 2003, and the main piece of legislation that we're going to look at is the UK Bribery Act 2010. So this was a modernisation of the law in the UK and will apply to all UK businesses and those that operate in the UK, so it's quite wide ranging. So it relates specifically to bribes and says that it is criminal to pay bribes, to receive bribes, and to not prevent bribes, crucially. So that means that businesses can be liable if they haven't prevented a bribe being paid, even if they're unaware that this happened. And that can lead to large fines for the business. This has been called one of the most draconian pieces of bribery legislation in the world. So there is a defence for the businesses, and that's if they have adequate procedures in place to prevent bribery. So what would those adequate procedures be? Well, if the procedures that you had were proportional to the risk, then that would let us know that they're probably going to be enough and adequate. If they have top level commitment, again, they're likely to be adequate. They must have a risk assessment. They must look at the country in which they're doing business, the sector in which they're doing business, the value of the business they're doing, and the business type, as well as crucially the people with whom they're doing business. They must communicate the procedures to staff throughout the organisation and carry out due diligence when they're taking on new business. Also, there must be a monitoring and review process over the procedures in the organisation. So some of the procedures we could actually have in place to prevent bribery would be reporting mechanisms, first of all, so that employees can report anything they find. We can screen employees that work for us and associates to make sure we're doing business with the right people. We can make sure to have an internal audit function. We could also have price and discount controls to make sure these aren't used as a means of giving bribes. We want to have a transparent bidding process so that all of the bids that are made are upfront. We also need to have approval of the decisions that are made. Some of the barriers that we can have to making these decisions and having these procedures in place. First of all, the time and cost of implementing them. Also, the business may feel it will dilute their competitive advantage, and they may simply have management apathy towards those procedures. Also, using off-the-shelf procedures can be a problem because remember, they must be specific to the risks facing your particular firm. Red tape can mean that the procedures don't get put in place, and pressure and targets can mean that employees sometimes simply ignore the procedures. So that was how we can go about preventing corruption. We also looked at how we make ethical decisions. And the first method is to undertake education throughout our careers. So this is under the IAESB's Ethics Education Framework that sets out how that's likely to happen. So they said it was a 4-stage process throughout your career. You start with the ethical knowledge that you'll gain during the exams, and you'll understand the ethical theories at that time. That then leads to ethical sensitivity, where you apply the principles but continue the learning process. Ethical judgments can then be made where you make reasoned decisions based on what you know. Lastly, that will lead to ethical behaviour through lifelong education and making ethical judgments. So we also looked at a couple of methods for resolving ethical issues. First of all, the AAA model, which is the American Accounting Association, which we can use then in a scenario-based question in an exam. So it's really 7 questions for making ethical decisions. And those 7 questions were to first of all assess the facts of the case, and then ask what are the ethical issues. Once we've identified the ethical issues, we can ask what are the norms, principles and values that apply to those issues. We can then set out our alternative courses based on those norms, principles and values, and decide what the best course of action might be. We'll then look at the consequences of that action, and that will ultimately lead us to the decision that we need to make. So that's a method for coming to an ethical decision. Also, we had Tucker's model for coming to an ethical decision by asking these 5 questions. Is the decision first profitable, legal, fair, right, and sustainable? And if it is all of those things, well then it's more likely to be the right ethical choice. So really the stages in making an ethical decision can be broken into, first of all, recognizing the moral issue. Secondly, making the moral judgment. Thirdly, establishing the moral intent, and then that will lead you to engage in the moral behaviour. So those were some ways that we can come to ethical decisions. We also talked about ethical behaviour and said that the nature of the issue can be changed depending on 2 things. The moral intensity, first of all, so that's looking at things to see whether there is a lot of intensity around the situation. If there's high intensity, that people are focusing on it, well then it's going to be more likely that we get an ethical decision. Also the moral framing, if lots of people are discussing it, well then we're more likely to get an ethical decision. And we also need to consider the context of the issue. For example, the reward systems in place may well lead to ethical behaviour. Roles and responsibilities being set could lead to ethical behaviour. The culture within the organisation will be important, as will the levels of authority and bureaucracy. So all of those can set the context for an ethical decision. So that was the second of our lectures on ethical behaviour.